Hello and welcome to the Active Inference Livestream. This is the Active Inference Lab, and we are here in Active Inference Livestream 18.2 on March 30th, 2021. Welcome everyone to the Active Inference Lab. This is a recorded and an archived live stream, so please provide us with feedback so that we can improve on our work. Wait, sorry, the video just changed a little bit. There we go. All backgrounds and perspectives are welcome here, and we'll all be following good video etiquette for live streams. Today, we're here in session 18.2 on March 30th, having the follow-up discussion with the authors and other participants on this predictive global neuronal workspace paper. And today, the goal is really to follow up on the last week's discussion, continue discussing and learning about this very cool paper and why the authors did what they did and what are the implications for different areas. So today we're just going to go through some introductions and warm-up questions, and then we'll be able to walk through the paper and the slides and ask a few questions to the authors and get a few different perspectives. So for the introductions, we'll just go around and introduce ourselves and then pass it to somebody who hasn't spoken yet. I'm Daniel. I'm a postdoc in California, and I'll pass it to Alex.
Thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Alex Vyatkin. I'm a researcher in Systems Management School in Moscow, Russia. Also, I'm a co-organizer for Active Inference Lab, and I pass it to Steven.
Hello, I'm Stephen. I'm based in Toronto, and I do a lot of work with social topographies and landscapes for sociodrama. And I will pass it over to Dean.
Hi, I'm Dean. I am retired. I'm hanging out in the loft of my cabin, which is not very well lit. I'll pass it to Ryan.
So I'm Ryan Smith. I'm a investigator at the Laureate Institute for Brain Research in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I mainly work on computational modeling of empirical behavior in different psychiatric disorders, as well as some theoretical work on emotions and emotional awareness and interoception. And I guess I'll send it to Chris.
Hi, I'm Christopher White. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge in England, and I mostly work on active inference or computation, using active inference with computational models of cognitive control. But a lot of my previous work is kind of focused on visual awareness. So I'll pass it to Adam.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm a postdoc at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. I'm also a research fellow at the Kinsey Institute, and I'm interested in consciousness. Free will too.
Is that everyone? Cool. Does anyone want to raise their hand and give a thought on one of these warm-up questions, which are just what are something they're excited or curious about today, or something that they liked or remembered about the paper or last week's discussion to sort of jumpstart where we were at? Or maybe really quickly at the beginning, Christopher wanted to clear up something. And then we'll kind of go into questions. So maybe everyone could write down a question and then Christopher, go for it.
Yeah, sure. So I said two things that just false last time, where I just made mistakes. I kind of wanted to correct them. So the first one I was specifically referenced, someone asked a question about the thalamus and its involvement in consciousness, and I kind of referenced a whole body of work from Matthew Larkham's group. And I think I said the medial dorsal nucleus, and it's not. It's central lateral nucleus and thalamus. I think 99% of people wouldn't care, but anyone who knows anything about the thalamus would have been pained by that. And the second thing was, when I was talking about King and DeHaan's Bayesian model of conscious access, I think I described the model as univariate Gaussian. That's also not correct. It's a multivariate, like Gaussian. Although you can extend the same model to a univariate case. Anyway, doesn't matter. But I just wanted to kind of correct those two things.
Thanks for the correction. So if everyone could raise their hand, and first we'll go with Adam and then Stephen.
I was curious about what Chris just said. So like medial dorsal, that would be what, thalamus for anterior cingulate in the frontal lobes, kind of like the gateway to like amygdala et al. Would that be right? And then what? So the centrolateral, like who's that looping with? I forget.
I think centrolateral would be looping. I was specifically thinking that like a loop between layer 5 pyramidal neurons and centrolateral thalamus.
So if I could ask a question there, just why are we identifying brain regions, or what would it mean to be identifying brain regions one way or the other in humans or some other species?
So this particular body of work, not to go too far on a tangent, but there's this really impressive body of work that basically has identified both level of consciousness and content of consciousness with burst mode firing in layer 5 of cortex. I think most of this evidence is from a mouse model, though. So interpret that as you will.
Yeah, Adam, or you can use the actual Jitsi. Raise hand. But yeah, go on.
I mean, for me, it would partially be what systems might contribute to wakefulness or different aspects of consciousness, depending on how we want to carve the joints on it in different respects. So let's say stimulating the medial dorsal was like more important. Well, then that might implicate like the specific relays, its ability to form thalamocortical loops or thalamostriatocortical, like the whole, what it helps to bind together functionally and other functions. It would tell you what processes might be involved. So maybe action or salience, that might be important. Or maybe it's like frontal lobes as hub, but like which part of the frontal lobes? Is it the parts that are like a general topologically central hub, or does it look kind of like a motor bit, or does it look like something else? And so we'd be trying to look for, like, fish around for clues about what's important in what ways, what it might mean. But it's easy to tell stories.
Okay, cool. So Stephen, and then anyone else who has a question.
So yeah, I'm just really excited about the when I listened last week. You talked about temperature being used in the models, and like you had different cases where you used different amounts of temperature in. I think it's in the Softmax function to show different types of model scenarios. So I'd just be curious. I'm just excited about maybe just the general way that you use your thinking to build the models to inform how you start to look at consciousness and the way the brain works, as much as the way that you find the results from the models. So that I'd be interested in that, those sort of two sides.
So I mean, one thing I just want to make sure this is clear is that, you know, like computational neuroscience borrows, or has been historically ended up borrowing a lot from terminology in physics and engineering and things like that. You know, so there's some of these sorts of terms that can be a little funny, right? So like temperature, like a temperature parameter, or typically an inverse temperature parameter, is something that's borrowed from physics that just kind of has to do within the physics sense, kind of how much you know, with how much energy particles are kind of bouncing around against each other. You know, in a very oversimplified way of putting it. But so it just means essentially there's more kind of randomness, right, in the system. So in the context of this, we're just applying that same equation to describe essentially the amount of noise in decision making. So higher temperature in this case is just a parameter in an equation that controls how deterministic versus stochastic decision-making processes are. So I just want to make sure that I just want to make sure it's clear to anyone listening that it has nothing to do with actual like physical temperature, like being hot or cold. It's just a parameter that kind of modulates how random decision making is. So I just wanted to make that clear. So in this case, it's just controlling. So for example, if the temperature parameter is really low, or the inverse temperature has a really high value, then that just means that, say, even if the model was only like 51% versus 49% confident in one thing over another, it would always choose the action associated with the 51%. Whereas if the temperature parameter value is high or is low, or is high, or the inverse temperature parameter is low, then that means that for instance, that with 51% of the time, it would choose the action associated with 51% or with 0.51 probability. It would choose that one less often than it would if the probability was, say, 0.7. And less probability than that than if it was if the probability was 0.9. So essentially, it just having a low inverse temperature parameter value just allows the probability of choice, the actual choices, the actual sort of frequency of choice to kind of scale in some sense with the actual probabilistic beliefs over the different states in the model.
Thank you, Ryan. We'll have Christopher, then Adam, and then anyone else who raises their hand.
So just to kind of contextualize that a little bit. So a softmax function is exactly the same function as a Boltzmann distribution from statistical physics. So often if you have you'll just use the same terminology because it has, and in the physics case, it has like a literal physical interpretation. In this case, it doesn't. So that's kind of why there's that overlap in terminology. In terms of deciding why or on those parameters or actually building them in, it was really just kind of came from thinking about what attention does. So what we were trying to modulate there was attention and signal strength. And both of those things in some way modulate the strength of feed-forward input. So when you think about that, we then kind of think, okay, what part of the model corresponds to that? Well, it's the likelihood matrix that maps, but that decides the precision of the mapping between external observations and first level hidden states. And so both the idea is that both attention and kind of external signal strength, or it might be something like contrast, whatever, will jointly determine the precision of that mapping. And then there's lots of different ways where you can kind of cache that out if you actually want to get into kind of the neurobiology of it, like the normalization model of attention or bias competition or something like that. But kind of extracting away from that detail, basically it just modulates the A matrix, the computational level of analysis. So that was kind of the thinking that went into it.
Very interesting. Adam, then Stephen, then anyone else. Okay, Adam, can you be ready to speak? But go for it.
Yeah, sorry about that. Oh, it's kind of off the current topic, but from before. So some quick Googling turned out the central lateral seems to be looping largely with parietal and temporal association areas. So that's potentially interesting in ways that indirectly could like speak to debates on the physical substrates of consciousness, like the brouhaha between IIT and GNWT. Is it more like the front of the brain or the back of the brain, and in which senses do they mean consciousness? But it's interesting. I actually am having trouble finding an image of like a diagram of the thalamus actually shows the central lateral nucleus. It's all just like, I see central medial, but not central lateral. It seems like they might be kind of like tucking it in with a pulvinar, whatever that means.
Stephen?
Yeah, just say thanks for that feedback. That was really useful. And I think also, because I've got a background in chemistry, I keep thinking about the Gibbs free energy, where it talks about temperature times change in entropy in that term. So it's like that the temperature is multiplied into the amount of entropy change there is to make it more significant. So that would kind of mirror why it's a bit like you're putting in noise or entropy. So that's quite useful. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, welcome, Blue. You or anyone else can raise their hand, but one chemistry metaphor, and again, Ryan, as you brought up, it's not always like a literal meaning, but thermodynamic versus the kinetic alternative for a reaction. So like the thermodynamic outcome for the candle is to burn because it has all this pent up energy, but it doesn't spontaneously combust because the kinetic barrier, the activation barrier, is too high. And then when there's like an enzyme or a spark of energy, then in the right situation, the product can go all the way down the big delta G to the kind of ultimate thermodynamic least energy versus the more kinetically accessible. And so that's kind of like information foraging. They're sort of the perfect citation you would find if you had the right search and it was that low temperature or something analogous. But then if it's too kinetically constrained, then the attention is drawn away. I'm not sure if that will map directly in this whole active inference mode, but it's just kind of another chemical informational distinction.
Well, I mean, so it depends. I mean, it depends how you're using it. Like in this case, there's not really much of a connection because we're just using a temperature parameter and a softmax function to control the precision of a mapping. Well, in a few different places. For attention and for stimulus strength, we're just using it to change the precision of the mapping between states and observations at the first level. So it just controls essentially how strong a sensory signal ends up updating beliefs, posterior observer states at the first level, and then modulated by a second temperature parameter that does the same thing, but that accounts for attention. So these sorts of things jointly control essentially how much evidence sensory input provides for posterior observer states at the first level. So we're using it for that kind of thing, and then we also use it for controlling deterministicness or the probabilisticness of choice at the second level of the model in terms of action selection. So in all those cases, I don't personally see a direct relationship between that and the kind of thermodynamic aspect of temperature, of getting over energy barriers and things like that. But I mean, I could be just not thinking through it all the way.
Stephen, then anyone else?
Yeah, so I think that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And I suppose the nice thing with the modeling is that you've got this potential to, I know you're using it, like you say, as this way to bring in noise or softmax, but it gives you that way to increase and decrease it, which in real life, when you do empirical work, it's hard to do that. So it's one of the strengths of the modeling that you can change that parameter and see. It seems to be one way that you really get insights into the dynamics of the system.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of just being able to modulate the or mimic the influences of attention on modulating the afferent precision of a signal.
Yes, Stephen, or Dean, and then Stephen.
Yeah, I just have a quick question here. And maybe this is far too oversimplified, but when you guys were doing this work, I started also looking at the effect paper. That I think the two together gave me a better sense of some of the work that I was doing around helping people walk into these novel situations pre-reflectively. And there is a tendency to want to commit, to want to pay attention, to want to give over whatever you have in terms of processing power to figuring out what's going on. But we had to spend quite a bit of time on helping people get the idea that there's this channel, there's this kind of sweet spot. And when you were talking about degrees, it brought it up for me again, the idea of how to help a person know when they're overcommitting, when they're overcorrecting, and when they're overcompensating. So when they're trying to do this estimation, how do they know that they're not seeing the moon walking bear because they're so committed to counting up the number of basketball passes. I wonder if you guys had spent a little bit of time looking at the other end of the channel when people actually readjust back in. And I know that's probably where the degrees part comes in, but I was just wondering about that.
So, I mean, are you imagining in some kind of like clinical scenario where a person
Yeah.
has like biased attention away from something that could be, say, aversive if they were to focus on it? Is that the kind of
Yeah,
thing?
exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's probably a mechanistic relation in a sense, just in the broad sense of, you know, how we think attention is implemented, right? So for example, if you think that, you know, a person is avoiding paying attention to something because it would be aversive, right? Then you can end up with this kind of implicit reinforcement of attentional policy selection, which we don't directly have in this model, right? The agent is choosing what the precision is associated with attention in this model, but that's something that can be added, and it's something that we have actually added in some more recent work that we're doing right now. But the idea there, or one way to think about that, would be that whenever a person essentially starts to pay attention to the thing that would be aversive, then it starts to feel aversive, right? So then if they pay attention away again, then the choice of paying attention away actually ends up being negatively reinforcing because the bad feeling goes away, right? Okay. So then what that ends up doing, at least according to this kind of reinforcement learning account, is that ends up assigning higher value to the policy of attending away, right? So over time, the probability of attending away just ends up getting higher and higher because it makes you feel better every time you do. So then this sort of avoidant attention can become really kind of habitized. So, you know, so that's one way of thinking about it. And so, you know, in the clinical setting, right, you want to help people potentially, you know, like start to, you know, gradually, you know, expose themselves to, you know, pay attention to this thing that's aversive, in hopes that if they're able to kind of do that in a sustained way, then over the long run, the aversiveness will go down as they kind of learn to better deal with the thing that they've been avoiding attentionally. You know, so that's you know, fairly tangential to, right, the kind of thing we're trying to do here. But you know, but there's a connection in this very kind of broad sense, in that if you can control attention and choices of what to pay attention to can be reinforced, then that's one way you can kind of end up with this kind of thing, where a person might not even know, right, that they've developed this strong habit, you know, not to pay attention to something. It just becomes very automated. You know, the same way any other behavior can be habitized via repeated reinforcement. But here, just it would be a kind of a cognitive action as opposed to a more overt behavioral action.
Okay.
Very interesting. Thanks for that question response. Adam, and then anyone else who raises their hand.
I guess to come out of left field, and what you were just describing, it seems like that could have some relation to maybe grounding, like psychodynamic-like concepts, in terms of if these patterns of attentional approach and avoidance can move from your C matrix to your E matrix, you can end up finding yourself in these sort of like garden paths of attending and coming to inferences for reasons that you might not even understand, just on the way your policy selections of attention have been shaped for conditions that might be too numerous and varied for you to track. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've written a few papers on this, right? Like, or I have with some colleagues. I mean, again, you know, my focus, you know, is largely in, you know, in terms of emotion and psychiatric conditions, right? And I would say it's a way of recasting the sorts of behaviors that psychodynamic approaches are trying to capture, but to do it in a way that doesn't actually posit the existence of these sorts of repressive, right? Like, you know, like unconscious, like there's no unconscious agent, right? There's no id, right, that's being posited that's sitting there keeping these things out of awareness, but somehow they're still present unconsciously, right? There's nothing like that, right? It's just a very simple story of having reinforced patterns of attention so it's a way of capturing the phenomena that I think psychodynamic approaches are often trying to capture, but it doesn't posit a lot of the kind of like ontological, a lot of the entities that are posited in psychodynamic approaches.
Cool. Stephen, then anyone else
One more
who raised their hand?
more
Or
thought
Adam,
on-
Adam, go for it.
So yeah, it's like, yeah, not saying like you're Freudian, but like, yeah, you're actually finding like the baby in the bathwater, rescuing it, cleaning it up, contextualizing it. Like, why did people have these intuitions to begin with? Like, what was the grains of truth? I'm wondering if through this could lead to like this kind of patterns of attending, some of which you're not tracking. This could be like an account of what would lead to potentially mismatch or discrepancies between things like stated and revealed preferences, or a thing like your actual affective disposition with respect to thing, and then what you think is going on, and then those could potentially go at cross purposes in ways that could be difficult to explicitly model, and potentially have like problematic sequelae or not. But I'm wondering if like this could lead to like a mismatch or cross purposes of attracting states at different levels.
I mean, I'd probably need more concrete examples to try to figure that out. I mean, that's probably something I'd have to think about more.
I guess one quickly would be like implicit affect tests or something like that. Like you say like, I'm not racist, but then it turns out, no, you are. And like, if you actually look at the reaction or something like that, or I am really happy in this relationship, but then like I measure your heart rate variability and it's crap, or things like that. Just this, your actual affective state might end up being different than what you think it is, and there could be like a lack of self-awareness, like a difficulty coming to coherent modeling of yourself because of these like shaped paths of attention. Like you might like miss the mark about you because it was like difficult to see, something like that.
I would think that, I mean, perhaps there are sort of some instances of the sort of thing you're talking about that could be captured by the kind of mechanisms that we're talking about here, or the kind of tangential extension of them that we're talking about here. But I'm not confident that all of them could. I imagine there's a number of mechanisms that you might appeal to describe some of those things, like implicit. Yeah, like I mean, if you're talking about like implicit associations on like an IAT, right, or something like that, that's probably, my intuition is that's probably different from it's more kind of like a right, which I know Chris has actually been working on models of truth tasks, right, which is probably pretty different from some of the other examples that you were giving, but yeah, I mean, like I said, I'd have to, taking a particular example, I'd probably have to think it through a little more to think about what kind of generative model would be able to reproduce the kind of behavior you're talking about, or most likely there would be multiple generative models that could reproduce it, and then you'd have to do some kind of experiment, right, to do model comparison and see which one actually best accounts for it. But again, I wouldn't feel really confident, saying what that might look like, just in the very kind of abstract general, description we're talking about right now.
Nice. Thank you for the response, Stephen.
Yeah, just bringing this point with this model that's now sort of maybe getting into the modeling part, is I think that's interesting with the awareness-based. There's a lot of work with awareness-based systems change and looking at awareness. And I like the, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we can move beyond being trapped in a psychology of the individual and pathology of the individual, and it moves into the intersubjective multi-scale. So like you talk about tasks, but it also could be used in taskscapes, organizational contexts or groups of people. So I just think that there's because the it's not nailed down to like a psychological model of the person's thoughts and feelings, but more a general model of the attentional structure. It has like a ability to move between scales and contexts. So I just think I'll put that out there as something that seems quite interesting.
Yeah, if I could just
there's
respond to that quickly.
there's more to. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
So I think the utility of models like these is to identify a very specific phenomenon, and that, namely, having conscious access to some content and not others. So I have conscious access to what's in front of me in my visual field at the moment. If I direct my attention around my body, I can bring up all sorts of, like, I can suddenly become aware of different kind of somatosensory bits of information. And all of these have very specific kind of neural signatures, as it were. What we're trying to do is really propose a model at a computational level of analysis and algorithmic level of analysis that explains these. And outside of that, I'm not sure to what extent actually talking about awareness, intersubjective awareness, is at all the same thing as talking about awareness as someone who works in, like, neuroscience of consciousness, for example. They might be, but I don't see any evidence that they are.
Pretty interesting, because it's in the title of the paper, so many people might think of it differently. It's just an interesting question, right?
Sorry, what's in the title of the paper?
Just the idea that the visual consciousness is involved.
Well, but again, this is a model of a particular visual consciousness task, right? So it's meant to account for things that are seen in the visual consciousness literature. The structure is abstract enough that, we would, and we say this in the discussion, that it ought to apply to cases of having access to one bit of information versus another in other domains, right? Like in the auditory domain, or something that I've been working on, with a bunch of colleagues at at Library, where I am, is trying to see if the same sort of thing, it looks like it's present in the interoceptive domain, for example. So I think it's right to say that we would hope anyway that it's abstract enough that it can account for any piece of information that you either gain access to or not, when it's being represented somewhere. So whether it's, right now as I'm talking to you, I'm not necessarily aware of what my heart's doing, but now I choose to pay attention to it, and all of a sudden, okay, I can kind of feel that it's beating at a certain rate. I believe that I feel. I wasn't conscious of that before, despite the fact that my brain was unconsciously tracking, what my heart was doing that whole time, right? So it could apply to being aware or not aware of any stimulus. So, only to the extent that when we say something about intersubjective awareness, only to the extent that that means something about a piece of information that, before I was attending to it, I didn't know, was there, but now that I'm paying attention to it, that I do. So for example, like if I happen to notice that a person's smiling or something like that, even though they were smiling at me the whole time, maybe my brain had picked up on the fact that they were smiling, but I wasn't aware of it until I focused my attention on it, or something like that, right? Or even maybe more abstract than that, when my brain sort of had unconsciously detected the smile, there might even have been some further inference that that means something about them being happy, right? So there might even be a case where I either do or do not gain access to this unconscious inference or this posterior belief that the person is more likely happy than unhappy or something like that, right? But these are sorts of cases that would have to be tested in their own right. But my broad point is just that it's an abstract structure where all it is meant to account for is when your brain is representing something and you either become aware of it or not.
If I could just kind of build on that slightly. So I think One, it's very tempting when we've got computational models that are relative, when we've got lots of equations sitting in front of us, to kind of think that, I think it's easy to get an illusion of rigor where there is none. The thing that makes these models meaningful is that we're tracking some real world phenomenon. In terms of the abstract model structure, it may be the case that, say, you have group dynamics where there's some aspect of that, maybe the individual behavior of individuals within a group evolves at a really quick time scale, and then the group decision making evolves at a slower time scale. You may be able, you could, in principle, fit a 2-level partially observable Markov decision process to this as a model of that behavior. But that would be very, very I think, even in that case, even when we're fitting the same model, I don't think that those are at all the same phenomenon, although there may be similarities across them. I would be extremely resistant to calling one visual awareness, or that a group has visual awareness.
Interesting. And of course, a parallel debate in the ant world. Is there a colony awareness or a single 6-legged ant awareness, or how should we think about distributed systems? And aren't we all kind of just distributed systems all the way down? So Adam and then Stephen.
So this would be related to, I guess, different types of intrasubjective awareness that you might believe is a model for. I recently uploaded a preprint after some conversations with people from the Brain Institute at Chapman University, basically trying to do the beginnings of like an active inference account of Lebesgue phenomena and readiness potentials that are a little bit less deflationary with respect to volition and conscious causation. And so, like, in like essence, I was thinking of like the actual moving your hand being like an accumulation of model evidence with respect to a proprioceptive pose, and it might be some sort of like conjunction of like also like like whether or not your like will or feeling of urge was part of it. You could think of that as like inference over your affective state, and that if these things are in what kind of alignments could help to explain whether you're like aware of readiness potential activity or whether this awareness is actually feeding back and contributing to it. And so I feel like your model could potentially like provide like a very precise contextualization of this, really settle what's going on, and I would like to collaborate. So.
So I mean, just again, Brad, just to make it really, maybe that could be the case. I have no idea, but it could only potentially be the case if what you're talking about, right, like what you're, motivated to do, or what you're, in the process of being about to do, or, whatever aspect of, action or action tendency or, anything like that. The only way this could apply is if you think that that information about what you're, what you're motivated to do, or something like that, whatever it is, only if it's the case that you think that is a represented piece of information that you can attend to or not, and that then you could sort of gate into the higher kind of deeper temporal level of the model that would inform verbal reporting and sort of other goal-directed uses. So it'd only be the case, I guess my point is this, is if the representation associated with action that you're talking about is in some sense formally equivalent to a representation of something visual that you can attend to.
That makes sense. So it's so the preprint is like it's like a 3-page, more of a promissory note. But if I could like pick your brain later about like if you think there's like a way we could actually get some like empirical traction and like nailing down the specifics along the lines you're saying. So.
Well, if you have a task and that task involves people paying attention to the aspect of action that you're talking about, then in principle you could have people, in some sense cue them or prime them or something like that that engages that sort of action bias or action motivation. And again, they can either attend to it or not, or report on it or not. In that case, yes, but otherwise, probably not.
It's a little tricky, I think, in terms of like the action that would be attended to would be of a couple varieties, but few of them would be directly observable. So it's like, you could say like, it's the action of the neural activity in terms of like the ramping activity, like do they have access to that? But I was thinking it could also be like the action of like mental acts and like rehearsing, like imagining in a kind of sophisticated affective inference sense, like, am I going to move my hand or not? What would that be like? And then that being contributing to that signal. And where like actual awareness of this like fictive action could be part of what would contribute to whether or not you feel ownership of it. Like it's interesting. Like some people don't show readiness potentials; they just act. Other people do. Like schizophrenic patients, they tend not to show readiness potentials before they spontaneously raise their hand. But it would be hard to get this. The action is internal, and so I don't know what you would do with that.
Yeah, it just seems like you have to have some kind of behavioral readout that can be fit to a model of this to be able to say that this explains the ability to consciously report on it or not, right?
So I guess could you use like right before leading to like the action, there tends to be like, it starts out like more bilateral, and then the ramp activity sense tends to go lateral, and then the hand moves. Could you use like that sort of signal as the readout, like the ensemble activity?
So in principle, you can use, you can fit models to neural activity. I mean, you can fit models to anything that the generative model generates. But I'm not necessarily all that confident that you'd be able to justify the claim that because the model in one case generates like a readiness potential signal, that has anything to do with having conscious access to something.
And you have the other problem, like if you're using like the ensemble activity, it's still the interpretation, like awareness of what? Like what are we even talking about with the awareness? The whole point is to try to like contextualize what those signals mean. And so
yeah, I mean, the point is, I mean, in the majority of cases, either directly or indirectly, like verbal report, right, is still kind of gold standard for whether someone has access to something, right? Even in no report paradigms, you're still later, right, asking them to report what they were experiencing at the time. So it's, I mean, and the issue is that in some sense, all kind of supportable or accepted sort of evidence for being consciously aware of something is always ultimately, and Chris, you can correct me if you think this is wrong, but I mean, I think that it always ultimately comes down to verbal report or some reliable correlate of verbal report, whether at the time or.
I agree with that. So I think I'm not an expert in no report paradigms, but to my knowledge, all of them, the reason we trust no report paradigms is because our measure, whether that is a particular mode of eye tracking or it is just like incidental memory afterwards, all of those things correlate really, really well with report. And that's the thing that kind of like makes us trust them as measures of conscious access independent of report. I think it's always, reports are foundational unless we have really, really good evidence. Otherwise, I think we have to take them kind of at face value, as it were.
Cool. We'll return to the stack. So Blue, and then Stephen, and then anyone else who raises their hand.
So Adam always brings me into this like metaphysical like thought space whenever he talks. And I just was wondering, in terms of this like visual model, you hear the expression that people see what they want to see, right? And so have you thought about maybe testing, like there's the idea of paying attention to something. And so have you thought about testing like whether, people can deceive themselves in this visual process, right? Like some self-deception, or even like you hear of like the power of manifestation. Like, can people bring into their awareness something because they simply want it to be there? I mean, have you thought about this or testing the model in this way?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I mean,
so if you go to figure, maybe scroll down. Is it?
Which one?
So we have a. Actually, I'm not sure. So that's the ERPs. Yeah, that the extended taxonomy. So we start with this kind of four-way taxonomy between which Tahan proposed, along with some other of his colleagues, of the kind of factors underlying whether you'll have conscious access to a stimulus, and he kind of broke it down into whether attention was weak or absent, present or absent, or whether kind of this how strong the signal strength was, whether it's weak or strong. And then we extended this by adding in prior expectations. So the extent to which you expect a stimulus to appear. And there is now like one of the big motivations of this work is that there is an enormous body of work now showing that expectation does play a fairly fundamental role, I think, in determining the contents of visual awareness. So as for whether you can voluntarily bring something into awareness, the answer is, I think that's more to do with attention, I suspect. But say, for example, if you are looking at a bistable image, you can attend to one part of that image and then have if it's I think it's called a Necker cube, you can have that cube flip, versus if you attend to another part, it'll flip back. And you can do kind of similar deliberate moves of attention with a lot of bistable images. So also, I think there's some really cool, there is some interesting kind of back to the kind of expectation thing and seeing what you expect to see. A lot of that depends upon how strong your bottom-up evidence is. If you are much more likely, so there are paradigms that kind of distract people, but basically condition them into expecting a stimulus to appear. And you can get kind of accidental hallucinate, or you can basically like induce people to what is essentially a hallucination in those cases, or mistakenly report something that we know as a fact. The experimentalists, they weren't there. I think there are two examples of that. What I have in mind at the moment is a really clever set of studies by Jean Aroux, but I know Ryan, and maybe you can talk about this. There's also a lot of work on conditioned hallucinations from a group at Yale, who I know you collaborate with.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean that was something I was actually going to bring up and this is not, yeah, because I mean I agree with you, Chris. In most cases, I think it's going to have to do with some kind of like motivated selective attention that kind of like biases, say, different possible interpretations that you have posteriors over states for the posteriors over states at the first level. But yeah, definitely you can have these expectation effects, although I don't necessarily think of those as being voluntary, right? I'm not sure that like selective attention is definitely a kind of controllable cognitive action, whereas shifting prior expectations, I'm less confident that that can be cast that way. But priors definitely have an influence, right, on what your posteriors over states are given some stimulus, especially like Chris said, when the stimulus strength is fairly low or noisy. So some of the work that Al Powers and his group at Yale, and then that we've been collaborating to build active inference models for this stuff, is these sorts of conditioned hallucination paradigms in people with psychosis. So the way these paradigms work is that you start out always showing people a light, and that is always coincident with a tone that appears in some white noise. And so on the first several trials, there's a fairly strong tone that plays in the white noise every time they hear a light, or every time they see a light, and it's thresholded so that they would perceive that tone 75% of the time. And then after several of those trials, there starts to be cases where the tone is still present, but it's weaker, so they only would detect it 50 or 25% of the time. And then there are trials where the light comes on, but no tone is played, and there's just white noise. And what they have found is that people with psychosis have a higher probability of reporting hearing tones when the light shows up, even when there was no tone. So it's just like a kind of so they build up this expectation to hear a tone whenever they see the light, and somehow those prior expectations that the tone will be there have a stronger influence over whether they hallucinate the tone or not. That influence is stronger in people that have hallucinations than in people that don't have hallucinations, which is kind of led to this idea that what's going, part of the computational issue in people with psychosis that are more likely to have hallucinations is that prior expectations are in some way really precise and therefore going to dominate perception. And that could be either because the prior expectations themselves are really precise, or because beliefs about the actual sensory signal are those are believed to be very imprecise. But in either case, the relative precisions are thought to kind of favor prior expectations in psychosis to a greater degree than in people without psychosis.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up really quick?
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you brought the auditory thing into this, but the auditory hallucinations. And I wonder if it's a visual cortex thing or if it's involved more with the auditory cortex, because even when Chris was talking, you think about like people have seen like when you have two things played simultaneously, auditory tracks, that like it's like listen for the phone number and then you hear the phone number, but then if you're not listening for the phone number, you're hearing something else. So it's interesting that the auditory system, like the selective attention in the auditory tract really is much more apparent, like where you see the blue dress versus the white dress or the gold dress or whatever color it was, like the two dresses is not so selective. It's like look for the blue dress or look for the white dress. If you set up that expectation in the visual system, it's not as prevalent, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I will agree that in my experience,
yeah,
it's definitely harder to switch the interpretation from the blue to the yellow. When I've tried that, I can get myself to do it, but it's way more effort for you, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Chris, if you have any ideas about why exactly that would be. I mean, I know cases of like, attention and calling binocular rivalry and things like that. In those cases, I think there are cases where I think selective attention can play a bigger role, like the Necker cube, for example. That's maybe a little more analogous to the kind of like multi-channel auditory input.
I think it just depends on how you set the task up. I'm not sure if the comparison is really a fair one, I suppose. I think you definitely can set up a lot of expectations play a huge role in the visual system, I think is one thing to say. Whether you have voluntary control, whether those things come under the purview of like voluntary attention is another thing. But I still think there are lots of cases depending on how you set up the problems. I think binocular rivalry is a good one, or even something like actually literally like where you move your eyes. I know that sounds trivial, but whether your eyes are moving around a page or not kind of determines some different types of visual illusions. So if you think about, maybe illusion isn't even the right word, but we're working on a project about this right now. What's it called again? Tom Spa has a paper on this, Ryan. Do you remember what's troxel-fading?
Yeah, I was going to say troxel-fading, yeah.
Yeah, if you Google troxel-fading, I think that's a really powerful example of where just kind of selective attention has a really major role on whether you perceive something as present or absent. Anyway.
Yep. Very interesting. It's almost like there's ambiguous and non-ambiguous stimuli in different domains, and maybe even interpersonal variation. One person being really good at picking up on something subtle in one domain or not. So we'll do Stephen, then Dean, then Adam.
I think this ties in actually to what I was mentioning earlier about when you scale things up, and I agree with what you're saying. When you scale things up, it may be useful to think about how someone facilitates the attention of people in a group and how you take them and how you think about taking their attention. It doesn't mean that whatever they consciously have intersubjectively together is now read by the model. So its usefulness may be in how people's attention is taken. And I think it ties to this hypnosis thing as well, because I think your model speaks to top down and bottom up happen at different level or different scales, because often we think top down, we think executive function, and like executive function is telling me what I think. But like you say, you can have a subconscious level of trying to think what something is, even if it's in the subconscious. You can, and hypnosis is doing that. Hypnosis is playing the game with someone. So they or with these optical illusions, you say to someone, this, you're looking at this cube from above or below, and it flips, but it's not that you're being told it's this type of cube and that your executive function's pushing it. It's still top down, but it's happening at a more subconscious, what we might call a subconscious level. And I think that's quite interesting.
So if I could just speak to that, I think there are a couple of things going on there. So I would talk about executive function. Well, I mean, I think one thing that this is a bit of a try point, but top down is a very ambiguous term. I think so you can mean that can mean anything from basically like recurrent loops from higher cortices that are higher up the cortical hierarchy, to something like top-down like voluntary control of attention via executive, like frontoparietal networks or something like that. So those are just different phenomena. I think in our model, control of attention would presumably be at, if we were to build a model of this, would be at this. You would put the dorsal attention network at the second slower time scale of the model, I think. Maybe Ryan, we can speak to this as well. I haven't really thought about this much.
I would have done a little more like executive control network sort of thing. I guess would have done a little bit more what I would have thought about just kind of off the cuff. But
yeah, you're probably right about that.
I mean, visual attention, right? I mean, obviously, right? The dorsal attention network is, kind of defined or originally, like linked specifically to, like visual attention and things like that, or kind of quote unquote top down visual attention. But in terms of the kind of directing, right, visual attention in a goal directed way, then I think that would be more executive control network. Or that's how I would thought of it.
I mean, on the hallucination point, I did my undergrad at Macquarie University, and they have a whole hallucination group there within the cognitive science department. And so I just feel like acutely aware of the fact that I don't know anything about it. And it's also an extremely complicated phenomenon. You can use hallucination to as a model of various delusions. Like you can induce, is it called mirror agnosia, where you no longer recognize yourself, mirror self-agnosia or something, where you no longer recognize yourself in a mirror. It's a really powerful tool, but I have absolutely no idea how it works. And so I would be very I think it's very tempting as kind of modelers and theorists to kind of go into various experimentalist domains, like, hey, here's how my overarching framework explains your thing. And I kind of want to resist that. I know a little bit about visual consciousness and how expectation, all that stuff works there, but hallucination is such a hairy topic. I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say, I mean, so there's a few different things that have been brought up here, right? But I mean, in terms of, it's not clear, for example, but the kind of auditory hallucination story that I was talking about earlier with in terms of having relatively, more precise prior expectations, creating a stronger tendency for auditory hallucinations. It's not clear at all that kind of story mechanistically is generalizes to other domains. So, I mean, actually, in the visual domain, there's this whole other body of work where it looks like people that have delusions, again, as part of psychosis, right? Actually show the opposite weighting in the visual system, right? So where they actually assign too much precision to low-level bottom-up visual signals. So they end up, as these interesting cases where they end up, if you look at eye tracking, they end up doing people with delusions end up actually, or psychosis, schizophrenia, end up doing better at certain tasks than healthy people, but worse at others. So like one example of this is if you have people just kind of try to follow, just visual tracking, follow a little kind of moving target. Then if that target switches directions really quickly, then the people with psychosis end up actually following it better than healthy people, because healthy people kind of continue to follow it for a little bit after the turn in the kind of predicted direction, right? So prior expectations are kind of playing a stronger role, so they actually do a little better. Whereas if instead you have something where the target temporarily kind of moves behind some kind of barrier, then healthy people do better, whereas people with schizophrenia kind of lose it because prior expectations don't do enough to keep them kind of following what the trajectory would have been, right, as it goes behind the visual occlusion. And there's lots of other cases, for instance, in like the proprioceptive domain, where people have talked about the same kind of thing, where people with schizophrenia actually do better with things like force matching illusions and stuff, or force matching tasks. And I mean, there's more to the story there, but people have tried to link that to like delusions about agency and things like that. So just general point being that that the way that kind of computational mechanism is looks like it happens in one, say, sensory domain, can still operate very differently in the other sensory domain, even in the same disorder, right? In the context of the same like psychosis. So these things don't necessarily, they shouldn't be expected to generalize across domains. Is one point. The other point was in relation to things like hypnosis, which I don't know a lot about. As part of a textbook chapter, I was asked to write a paragraph or two on hypnosis, so I kind of looked into that literature a little bit. And it's actually pretty messy. There are multiple different theories about how hypnosis works. And I mean, one of them, can relate to this idea that if the hypnotist repeatedly like gives suggestions that are set up such that they will be confirmed, right? So it's like, the hypnotist says, hold out your arms. And then he says, your arms are going to start to feel heavy, and then they'll start to fall, right? Obviously, anybody who holds out their arms, they'll eventually start to feel heavy, and they'll heavier, and they'll start to drop just as a result of your shoulder muscles getting tired, right? So if you do a number of those things, and the kind of things the predictions made by the hypnotist are confirmed, then it could be that you're just coming to assign a really high reliability to whatever the hypnotist says, right? So in that case, if the hypnotist just comes to be assigned really high precision, then you can just adjust prior expectations in a way that just kind of dominate, or can end up having a much stronger influence on what you do. And that's kind of one idea. But again, there's several other theories of hypnosis that just have to do with kind of like conforming to kind of social roles and things like that you're told to do. And I mean, anyway, so I wouldn't necessarily feel all that confident saying much about how this relates to hypnosis, other than that, in a broad sense, it can involve manipulating sort of tricky ways of manipulating prior expectations in other people. But again, I mean, even that is pretty speculative.
I mean, so if I could just quickly throw something in, another complicating factor. So even within the visual system, having a strong prior in one domain or doesn't generalize to others. There's this really great paper that came out, I think, last year in Cognition, where they looked at representational momentum, Mooney images, and goodness, I think there was one other, I think it was illusory contours, and they had one other like top-down expectation kind of paradigm. And there were large individual differences between all of them. And there were also large individual differences in kind of the effect of prior expectation across those different tasks. So I think there's just kind of a lot of complicating factors, like moving parts and a lot of this stuff that we have to deal with when we talk about these things.
Okay, we're going to return to the stack and go to Dean, and then a question from the chat, and then Adam.
So I'll go back and be ambiguous. So when I was looking at your diagrams, and one of the things that really, I wanted to ask this question, but we ran out of time last week. Do you think we can say that if a person says, I see this, or I do not see this, the or, yes or no, can we apply an idea that there's a certain amount of acceptance and a certain amount of letting go? And I kind of bundle that under we reconcile, or is it something completely different? I mean, how do you look at this now when a person's actually looking at something and going, okay, I do not see the box? Is it that simple? That's a simple yes, no, or do you think there's something more built into it?
So there is a whole cottage industry. I feel like cottage industry might even be an understatement on how to collect verbal reports and the proper ways of doing it. So there's like a perceptual awareness scale where you in some sense have a description of the content. So you have, I didn't see anything, I maybe saw something, but there was no specific content. Like you have a vague feeling. You saw something, but it was a bit blurry. And then you had like a full vivid experience. That's one way. You can have people place bets. That's another way. You can have people do confidence ratings. Lately, there's been some incredibly clever work basically looking at, so just give a shout out to people whose work I really admire, like Hakwon Lau and Megan Peters have a really great paper in eLife where they basically show that people seem to have optimal, in the sense of like Bayes optimal, introspective access to their own performance. So basically, when people never behave correctly without kind of knowing that they behaved correctly, as it were, if you do these like very tightly controlled experimental situations. So yeah, I think maybe I was a bit flippant before when I said you have to take reports as foundational. I stand by that statement, but there is like years and years and years of like careful psychophysics that have gone into being like, yeah, these things are reliable. And basically it comes down to, I wouldn't believe if someone said, yeah, I see something, but they were getting like 50% on a forced choice task about the orientation of a Gabor patch, but they were claiming they would see it, I just wouldn't believe them. Generally speaking, you would expect if you see something, your performance should also go up. That is not to say, however, that you can't have increased performance without awareness. There is some convincing evidence showing that those two things dissociate, and that's kind of what we were trying to show here.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, it does.
Nice. Yeah, I noticed on this extended taxonomy, the bottom right, it's like consistent prior, high attention, strong signal. It's the perfect storm. And then it's 100% seen, 100% correct. And then again, kind of taking it loosely mapping to our experiences with other attention phenomena. Like if you're sure about seeing, and it, of course, the way that you tuned prior or inconsistent prior, these are variables that are in the model. So people can play around. This isn't like a specific yes, no, but just examples of how rich the phase space is in terms of what the model can do and what it can capture. So here's the question from the chat, and then it will go to Adam. So the question from the chat is, any thought about the possibility of using this model to investigate lucid dreaming related phenomena, like the failure of implicit metacognition while dreaming? Thank you. So how about dreaming or lucid dreaming?
So that stuff is super interesting. I mean, I don't think this model captures it at all, except in like a computational sense. Like I don't know what task would be modeling specifically, but like we can, if we're being a bit metaphorical about it. So presumably, I don't know anything about lucid dreaming. I presume it's a case where basically you are dreaming, so you have you're not just asleep, you have kind of a experience that goes along with it, and also you are aware of the fact that you are dreaming. That's really interesting. I think it would have to come back to I don't know how one would capture metacognition in this framework. I think that's one thing to say. I don't know what it would be. Maybe Ryan, you have some thoughts on this, but it would relate to basically how one thinks about metacognition in these deep temporal models.
Yeah, I mean, metacognition in and of itself comes in a bunch of different flavors, right? I mean, so there's kind of, beliefs about how good your memory is, for example, right? It can be kind of metacognition. It's, it's like beliefs about your beliefs, or beliefs about patterns in your attention, or, there's a bunch of different types of metacognition, right? It's just sort of beliefs or operations over representations of your own cognitive processes. So, I mean, the tricky part is that you kind of have to have a higher level that's treating what you chose to do, in terms of a voluntary cognitive process, that observes that and then infers something about it. The way that ends up influencing the cognitive operation level below, right? The way that higher metacognitive level ends up setting priors on the lower level. I'm not sure the right way to think about that. You'd have to look at literature on the way metacognition affects, performance on cognitive tasks, which I'm not. I'm definitely not an expert at.
One thing to say, just very briefly, would just be in the discussion section of our paper, we discuss alternative models. I think probably the model that's closest to ours in the literature would be Steve Fleming's higher order state space model. And I think there he explicitly discusses ignition-related phenomena and kind of metacognitive inferences about the presence or absence of stimuli. So I would say if you're interested in that kind of stuff and how to think about it in a Bayesian framework, look there. It's a really great paper.
Yeah, another one, that comes to mind, I know, is that there's a paper by where the first author is Klaus Stefan from 2016, where he talks about the way you can apply active inference models to model homeostatic and allostatic control processes. So basically, like anticipating, for example, that your temperature is going to drop, and therefore increasing body temperature a little in advance, so that when it subsequently drops, you stay in a within a kind of survivable homeostatic range. I'm just using temperature here as an arbitrary example of any kind of variable, internal bodily variable, right, like glucose levels or hormone levels or anything like that. But they do talk about this level, a metacognitive level that you can add above the allostatic regulation level that more or less tracks the efficacy or the kind of success of the allostatic level, and how if the allostatic level repeatedly fails to keep homeostatic variable or keep bodily variables within homeostatic ranges, then the higher level can basically infer that allostasis will fail. And they show how that can plausibly lead to certain sorts of symptoms of depression when you have low beliefs about the efficacy of your own allostatic processes. So, that's a paper that I'd recommend looking at for one example of the way that you might apply one type of metacognition on top of the Bayesian model.
I also just remembered a paper came out yesterday. I shared it. Sorry, I forgot about this. I shared it on Twitter yesterday. If you want to look, it came out of Mike Allen's group at Aarhus. I've forgotten the first author's name. I'm really sorry about that. But they explicitly discuss like predictive processing and active inference theories of consciousness in relation to interoception and metacognition, and they have a whole discussion of this type of thing. So if you're interested, maybe just like check my Twitter page or at Mike Allen's Twitter page.
Sounds good. We'll go to Adam and then anyone else who raises their hand.
Hi. Perhaps tying a few of these things together. I was wondering if, like, with respect to hallucinations and psychosis and forms of delusions, if maybe some of it you could potentially model it in terms of not having access to mental acts, so which might have like associated efforts copies that could potentially like be adjusting precision, and or also having different components of the associated mental act which you may or may not attribute to like like aspects of interoceptive inference that could lead to senses of like willing or ownership, but then by not having access to this potentially where the access itself of the action generation could basically adjust how you're attributing what sense you're making of the associated perceptual events. So it's like, how would I say this? So it's like if you're talking to yourself in thought or something like thought is inner speech, like Vygotsky would talk about. Like, well, if you don't have access to like the generation part for some reason, I don't know how much it could even be separated, but then like the voice might just like appear to you in a way where you don't have a sense of ownership. If there's not like the right type of like maybe interoceptive coupling to the generation process, or just like a lack of metacognition to contextualize it. Anyways.
Yeah, I really like this idea.
That, I mean, one thing to keep in mind here is that, you know, the sort of thing that you're talking about when people have sort of different experiences of, or where there are different contents in experience. I mean, basically that's what you're talking about, right? Different contents that can be in experience. Those are just, in a model like this, going to amount to different sorts of state spaces that you can infer posteriors over, right? So, you know, you can have beliefs about how much ownership you have over your body, or you can have beliefs about something going on in your body interoceptively. And all those things are just going to be, you're going to have some sort of afferent signal, and you're going to have some prior expectations, obviously, and then you're going to infer some posterior over whatever the contents are of the thing in question, right? So anything along the lines of what is the content of one thing versus another is just going to amount to a particular level in a model that infers posteriors over particular contents, right? So none of that is going to have to do directly with our model, other than the fact that given posteriors over any content, you know, if our model were applicable to that, you could just treat those contents as the lower level, right? So you'd have inference over some content, and then our model would say something about the processes that make that content conscious or not, right? Or consciously accessible or not. So the only thing that our model might be able to say is, if you swap out the, you know, squares versus lines in our model, right? Whatever the beliefs are at the lower level, you swap that out with representations of some other content, whatever it is you're interested in, you know, something about the body, or something about what pattern of, what sequence of speech, right, that you're hearing, or anything like that, right? What word you just heard. You know, swap that out as the content of the lower level, and our model might be able to say something about the processes that determine whether those contents become accessible or not. But beyond that, our model doesn't have much to say.
Yeah, I mean, if I could say something on that as well, I really like the idea. I think just along similar lines to Ryan, because it just casts like decisions about ownership as just having access to some content or another. And so for me, like the essence of any type of conscious access or awareness process is basically whether it's integrated into this temporally deep representation, and in doing so available to all of these sub-processes, a la global workspace theory. And so I think this kind of relating this to kind of the metacognitive point, I think this is actually a spot where maybe this is a difference between our theory versus an active inference theory that gave an explicit role for metacognition. So for me, it's just the fact that you can be aware that you're aware of it because it's integrated into this representation, right? Whereas maybe a higher order person would be, no, you have to also infer that you are seeing it, or that I am seeing it, or something like that. And so I think these are actually like really interesting empirical questions. That's all I'm going to say. But I hope that we can kind of, I don't know, maybe it would be nice to see a discussion of kind of active inference theories of visual awareness, of metacognition versus active inference theories of like visual awareness in general. Anyway, yeah, I don't know if I know you've written a lot about kind of different theories of consciousness, Adam, so I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I mean, I know that you know, there's this preprint by the first author is Smith, Lars. Well, I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Smith. That does propose a type of model of metacognition. Theirs attention works a little differently than in ours, but essentially you do have a second level that controls a precision parameter on the first level, and then there's a third level in there that infers things about control of the temperature parameter at the first level, if I'm remembering right. And they use it as a way of, the way they talk about it is a way to think of like meditation and mindfulness and things like that, which I'm not, you know, I don't remember it in enough detail to say a lot about, you know, my specific feelings on that, but that is an example that I'm aware of again, it's just a preprint at this point, but of another attempt to try to model something like metacognition.
Cool. Interesting questions. Adam, did you want to say something else? Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so I basically want to throw your model at everything. But in terms of metacognition and what I've worked on in the past, mostly I've been focusing on like trying to cross-reference various theories to see the points of like overlap and non-overlap, mostly considering like accounts of dynamic modularity that might apply to a global neural workspace architecture, or like integrated information theory, where you can think of their complexes of integration, those modules as themselves being like, do an IIT handling of those and seeing like, where's the overlap, basically trying to give semantic content to IIT via like GNWT as like an architecture for Bayesian model selection, and the whole thing kind of being adjudicated by the free energy principle and mostly an active inference, not nearly in the technical depth that you have. I'm only beginning to move into things like metacognition and like higher order forms of consciousness. And the ideas are like really speculative. Like, so like one idea is that like, as you're like, let's say, imagining like enacting something, you might start out from like generating like experience from an egocentric perspective. But then this enactment would auto-associatively also have third-person allocentric representations, like from like the ventral visual stream or something like this, where like you've seen people or yourself doing similar things. And so you might then like be able to get access to in the mind's eye this like third-person point of view on you with some unfolding, like some sort of like moving back and forth between a first person, like I guess it, in the models I'm working with, like phenomenal consciousness is all and accessible consciousness. There's a sense in which, like in a Rudolph projective geometric modeling, it's always from this first person egocentric point of view. But then the idea is you then are looking at an objectified you, and this would be part of metacognitive awareness and contextualizing you in terms of like you doing actions, and then this third person little homunculus doing actions that you're seeing in your mind's eye and moving back and forth. That's like the basic space I'm moving into. I don't know how much of that's going to work or how you would model that.
Well, so
I mean, like one thing, just kind of,
I mean, again, just to, I mean, when you think about this kind of in formal terms, right? Then, if you're, in some sense, if you're, the content you're describing as a belief that you are doing something, right? So that's just the content in the state space, right? So same kind of thing, right? Swap out our lower level with a state space that is beliefs about what I am doing, right? Then it's just the same thing, right? You have a representation about what you are doing, and in our model, you would either gain access to the representation of that content or not via its integration with this deeper temporal level. Granted, beliefs about what I am doing, or not, is already, right, pretty temporally deep. But were those sorts of contents to apply to our model, and that's what it would say. It would say that those contents need to be integrated with this deeper temporal model that is able to form posteriors over something that incorporates that. So again, I mean, at the end of the day, it really just comes down to this distinction about the content being represented and whether or not the posteriors associated with that content get integrated with the higher level that does the sorts of things that the higher level described here can do. So it's just a question about whether something like that is the content that you want to be using in a goal-directed way of reporting, or whether just representations of the lower level kind of visual content, right? And that being integrated with this level is what's involved. So to me, again, this just has to do with different levels of representation and what the contents are that you're becoming conscious of. Oh, and by the way, just to mention, I looked up the paper I was mentioning. So it's called Toward the Formal Neurophenomenology of Metacognition, and the first author is Lars Sandved Smith. Just to do justice to remembering who the first author's full name was and the name of the paper I was talking about. So, sorry, I think you started saying something at the same time, Chris.
Yeah, Christopher, then Adam.
Oh, I was going to change the topic very slightly, but I was wondering, so how you think about phenomenology or phenomenal consciousness, because to me, it comes down to the nature of the representation that you're gaining access to. So to talk about, like, you talk about the projective consciousness model, which is really cool work. There, this perspectival nature of consciousness comes from the structure of the generative model and the fact that they're using this projective geometry, and that's built into the structure of the generative model. I'm just curious about how you think about this and how that kind of maps on to IIT, because at least as I understand IIT, like phenomenal consciousness is kind of it's never really been clear how the content of consciousness fits into IIT for me. Like it's all, anyway, yeah, I'm just a bit interested to hear your thoughts, how it all fits together with like global workspace theory.
Well, like, yeah, I would say there's some kind of giant begged questions in IIT. I think, though, it's not nothing that they start from axioms of what they think should be part of phenomenology and then work their way to this sort of way of handling systems. In terms of, I think it's a decent prior for like what we should look for in like physical substrates. I wouldn't like completely like throw it off, but they then would say, if you have these axioms that characterize experience, intrinsic existence, composition, information, integration, exclusion, if you have these different properties, then it is sufficient to bring about phenomenality because they started from phenomenality. Oh no, I don't think that follows at all. That being said, I think it does potentially like give us some priors in trying to think about physical and computational substrates of consciousness. So that would be like the cross-referencing. And then the other part would be like, how do you think, so if you're thinking of global neuronal workspace as like potentially like a trading off of modularity as being part of the physical implementation, well then the question is like, so when do you have like larger big modules functioning as like dynamic cores or workspaces? And when do you have like more fragmented like local processing? So like in theory, you could get like Bayesian model selection with like discrete updating with like a bunch of like small beta complexes close to the modalities. or it could be like this big sprawling alpha complex that's like that's multimodal in all these different ways. But then like you're moving back and forth between these like degrees of synchrony. Seems like IIT could potentially be useful there for describing that. So that was one of the ideas of that interrelation. In terms of like kind of bringing it to Rudolph, like for me, like the object I would want that would be like potentially a minimal condition for phenomenality would be some sort of joint distribution over your body pose and visuospatial awareness as like the minimal thing for me, at least for human-like consciousness, and like a series of basically roughly at alpha frequencies, a series of estimates of that. And thinking of this as iterative Bayesian model selection via a global workspace architecture, but not necessarily one where there's like access. That's like a more sophisticated kind of consciousness in terms of, you wouldn't necessarily, like, I would call it like, it's pretty darn global. You have something like spanning all of the posterior cortex, but it's not the kind of workspace you're dealing with where you're actually having knowledge and access.
Thanks, Adam. So if anyone else wants to, they can raise their hand. Otherwise, I think there was a very good request. Just you did just ask one, so let's mix it up. But there was a very good request actually. If Ryan or Christopher, you could just look at this part of the figure, which I know is a structure we walk through in the model stream as well, and just kind of map some of these bigger ideas that we've been talking about to some of the letters, just in a way where people can now look at this outline and say, okay, the experiment, I'm kind of on the page. We talked about a bunch of visual and interoceptive kinds of experiments. Just where did it map in this paper, so that people will always be able to go back to this paper, look at the code, and then kind of map some of these bigger metaphors to the experiment that you did here.
Sure. Do you want to take this, Ryan, or do you want to? I don't mind.
I mean, either way, it doesn't matter to me. Go for it.
So, how detailed would you like me to go? Would you like me to explain what the little square, what the D's and A's and B's and S's are, and all that stuff?
Let's go for all the letters on the right side, and maybe even some on the left.
All right. So this is a partially observable Markov decision process, and it's a hierarchical one. So at the let's just focus on essentially. Let's start at the bottom. O's are observations, and S's are hidden or latent states. And what the A matrix does is it provides a mapping between those two things. So the circles are random variables, and the squares are essentially functions, in this case probability distributions, that map between those two things. So the A and little arrow going down just says that that's essentially with that little A superimposed on arrow is basically saying that's expressing a conditional probability distribution, saying that O, observations, depends upon the hidden state. Now, as we start to evolve through time, we need transitions between discrete, hidden, latent states in the world. And those are what's described by B. So this is something like, what is the probability that at time 1, what's the probability of each hidden state at the next time step? And it will describe kind of S at t conditioned on S at t minus 1. Now, then what's special about deep hierarchical models is that you have another layer on top of that, where hidden states at the first level are now being treated as observations by the second level. And so the posterior probability at the first level is basically acts as an observation for the second level A matrix. And then kind of at the second level, there should be a D at the first level too, but that's fine. Basically what this second level hidden state does is it provides a prior over that first level. And then at the first level, you can then have, basically we just have one time step at the first level, but you can have any amount of time steps as you want. So if you imagine the metaphor that's often used is like the minute versus the hour clock on the hand. They're evolving at different time scales. So you could, in this diagram, we show that the second level evolves at 2 time steps for every 1 time step at the first level. At the second level, sorry. At the second level, there are again transitions between these latent states, and that's also where we have policy selections. That's why we put it up there. So policy selection is essentially, if you imagine a whole series of hidden Markov models. This is my favorite way of describing policy selection. So these hidden Markov models are basically just a partially observable Markov decision process without the decision aspect. If you imagine a whole series of basically these graphs, and you are deciding what graph kind of is going to be my future, you are trying to find the graph with the highest model evidence. That is what computing, doing policy selection does. So you are choosing the transitions that will take you to basically the graphs with the highest model evidence. I know that, Brian, do you want to kind of clean up some of that explanation?
We're at the shoulders. Let's go to the last few variables.
Yeah, so I mean,
Okay.
I mean, you didn't do G and C and E, right? You kind of
Yeah,
stopped
sorry.
Yeah, okay.
But
Right,
okay.
so pi, and just like Chris said, right, it's just your distribution over policies. G is the expected free energy. So that's essentially the function that decides, right, which what the value is. You can think about it about each policy, and that is with respect to C, which is your preference distribution, which is essentially the thing that specifies which observations you want and which observations you don't. Now, somehow I see that an E has been placed with an arrow down to G, and that's not correct. E should be going straight to pi. If you're going to include E, I don't think we did anything with E in our model, so I don't think E needs to be there. But E, if it's used, is just a kind of separate prior over policies that can encode something like habits. So it competes with the expected free energy, G, over policies, to infer when you're inferring what the posterior over policies is. So yeah, I mean, otherwise, I feel like Chris described it well. I mean, it's always a little easier if you have like if you're in control of the pointers, you can actually, point to the things that you're talking about.
I think you also asked us to relate this to an experimental paradigm. So if we maybe briefly click down to figure 2, what you've labeled as figure 2 there, so we can just look at that. So the idea here is that there was a forwards mask. At the beginning of the paradigm, this was just a series of lines, and there were these kind of stimuli on the outside. At the second time step in the task, or in our like simulated task, on some trials, the square kind of was self-organized. Some of the lines kind of self-organized into a square. So i.e. either in our discrete state space model, a square was present or it wasn't. And in the third time step, it was just replaced by more lines. And then afterwards, we asked the agent to construct a report of that. So basically you can think of the first level of the model as being all of the features of the stimulus and also the location of attention. So this might be something like saliency maps in posterior parietal cortex, which are directing wherever attention's being pointed to. You might have the features of the stimulus, which are represented in various places. At the second level, we now have this is basically our frontoparietal cortices. This is tracking the evolution of states at the first level. So it's tracking that at the first time step, there was lines presented. At the second time step, there was a square presented. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was presented. Maybe it wasn't. And at the third time step, there was more lines. And you can imagine in like a real task, all of that unfolds in a space of about a second.
Yeah. So you can think about it. I mean, the second level is really the content in question that it's inferring is the sequence, right? It's not whether there's the square, it's whether it was lines, square lines, or just lines, lines, lines. And that goes to, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and so if you're thinking about where experience lives, obviously we don't experience a sequence, right? I think Ryan and I have been chatting about this a lot lately because it relates to work we're currently doing. But I think what's going on is that what we experience are essentially like the updates to our second level beliefs. And that's really crucial. So the reason why it's crucial is because we know empirically that at kind of what could be, we might describe as brain processes that are at the first level of the model. These can be either conscious or not. And contents that are conscious, when you are conscious of something, it has all of these really important functional consequences. So here it might be kind of being able to see it for report, maintain it for report. But also, if I see something, I can involuntarily maintain it in memory for as long as I want, as long as I don't get distracted. Like there are limits on like human psychology. But that's kind of a really important function that's enabled by being conscious of something, right? And that allows us to do things like construct reports of our experience. Or even, I think by report, I just mean something very general. It could be in this model, we kind of have the toy thing of being able to like put a sentence together, but it could also be more empirically real. In terms of empirical paradigm, it'll just be like hitting a button or doing a confidence task, doing a confidence interval or something like that.
Cool. Thank you for that. Interesting answer. We'll have Stephen and then Adam and then anyone else who wants to raise their hand, and also any last questions from the live chat as we kind of slowly land the plane.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, in relation to those lines and the way that the square appears, like you said, so this is actually like a graphic representation, but when someone looks at it, there's probably some special device that you've got that represents this. Is it like that the lines rotate and at some point, and it just happens they rotate such that they line up and then they unrotate? Or, and just one other question is, why didn't you use negative space? Like say they line up to make, like a negative space square. I just wondered whether that relates to the choice of how it pops in and out of phenomenological awareness, phenomenological consciousness or access consciousness.
So basically, like, this is just in our model, we have discrete hidden states, which are categorical distributions, which are lines or squares, and external states, which are red. And so this is kind of just a graphical representation of a way to think about that, but it's really nothing to do with how it works mathematically. Then in terms of actually the empirical task, like this is a task that we basically like borrowed from Michael Pitts, who's he's a cognitive neuroscientist, done a lot of really important work in the area of visual consciousness. And as for why they chose to kind of have these, I think from memory, there are videos attached to this paper. From memory, I think the lines just kind of, they jitter around, and then occasionally a subset of them will all line up into a square and then go back to like jittering. As to why they did that versus other methods, like, I don't know, really. There definitely are subtle things you can do to a stimulus which have major impacts on whether you have conscious access to it or not. But the phenomenon of inattentional blindness is super general. Like these are, you can have people. So the really famous example is that everyone gets shown in like undergrad psych is you're tracking whether a group of people playing basketball, and you ask how many times does someone with like a white shirt get past a ball or something like that, and your attention is distracted, so kind of consumed with that a bear or a gorilla can like walk into the middle of the screen, be in the dead center of your fovea, wave at you, and then walk away. And then about 50% of people don't see it at all. And that's really well replicated across a bunch of, or they don't report seeing it, I should say. I think there's some debate about whether this is a memory phenomenon or any of that. There's lots of subtleties there, but so hopefully that answers the question.
Yep. Also, one advantage and one rationale for these pure modeling papers that we're discussing today is the space of the possible human experiments, or even any other kind of real world experiments, is very limited. it's very limited what you can actually have a real set of humans do. And so it's great to have tools that help us explore some of the patterns that we're looking for and understand how variability and do statistical calculations, like how many participants we need of a given variability range if we want to capture such and such an effect without distorting it this way. That's critical information. And if you don't have the model, then the experimental design phase is totally blind and it's very shot in the dark. And so this helps inform structures for even thinking about how to design human experiments. For example, as we're talking about here with visual awareness, but it could be for other kinds of experiments. So Adam, and then anyone else who wants to make a comment. See you later, Alex. Bye. Adam?
Hi. I'd be curious in knowing more of your thoughts on the potential, I guess, richness or lack thereof of experience. So, like at one point, like, could consciousness be phenomenal or access more experience as a series of snapshots that are like static, sequential, but we don't know it, like a flip book? Or is it more like a continuous stream? Like if you're getting this discrete updating, are these updates over like the agent in like motion? Like if you take like a camera, sometimes in your phone, there's like a little brief like forward ahead, like look ahead and back. But like, what would be the nature of these discrete updates?
I mean, I know the, like, I'm trying to remember. I know, and I remember reading Stan DeHaan's book a few years ago, and there is some work, I think, showing, you know, there's like a minimal time for like essentially updates to the content of consciousness that have some kind of discrete character to them. I don't remember what the
psychological refractory period.
Yeah, do you remember the actual like milliseconds? I can't remember, like 50 milliseconds or something like that. Yeah, I don't remember offhand, but there is something, you know, like that maybe might be, you know, like similar to like a refresh rate or something like that. But I don't remember too much about that offhand. But I mean, one thing to say is that, you know, because, you know, there are these sorts of discrete updates in our model, but I mean, it's also good to remember that the higher level representation is specifically about this sequence, right? Which is integrated in a sense that the hypothesis is about a whole sequence that doesn't necessarily need to be thought about as having sort of discrete chunks to it, right? It's just a single hypothesis about what the whole sequence was. And so you might think about that, right, as having a more kind of continuous character to it, despite the fact that it is updated in some ultimately discrete fashion, you know, in kind of these really fast bins. Or maybe we can think about it that way. But in terms of richness, I mean, to me, I mean, I just tend to think of rich as meaning there are more precise features, right? There's more features that are more precise at the lower level, right? So instead of just, you know, a lines or a square, right, in our example, there could be a ton of different lower level representations, you know, about color and shape and size and, you know, all these sorts of things that are represented in some sort of joint way, right, and become accessible. And so, I mean, that's one way to think about richness, is just what are all the things being represented that become accessible together. But I don't know. Do you have something
Can I
else
ask a question actually there about the continuous modeling? Is it possible that active inference could have a continuous mode?
Yeah,
I know that it would get rid of a lot of the discrete benefits and the sequential message passing, or maybe other heuristics, but could there be a continuous format, continuous time or space?
Yeah, no, there are continuous state-space models, and there are also mixed models. You know, mixed models are kind of especially nice and probably a lot more realistic here. You know, because visual input, a lot of the things that are represented by the visual system are continuous, right? Like motion, for example, is continuous. Brightness, you know, all these sorts of things, and so those can be perceived and represented in a continuous scale at the lower level, it still get passed up to discrete representations at the higher level. We didn't do that here for simplicity, but you could.
So
I was just to clarify. I was
yeah.
in scaling active inference. We did talk about the continuous state space. I was just wondering if it's possible to have a continuous time active inference model rather than a discrete time model of T1, 2, 3. Just bringing it up. Okay, but then Christopher and then Blue.
So yeah, three things. So just quickly to answer your question, Daniel. So hidden Markov models are just like a super general thing. It's basically just when you have a Markov chain, but you have but each state of the Markov chain links to some outcome. Those outcomes can then both the outcomes and the latent states can be continuous. When you have a discrete latent state continuous outcome, you end up with a Gaussian mixed with like basically what ends up being a mixture of Gaussians model. And when you have, if you have continuous states, you end up with I think you basically end up with a Kalman filter. And you can stack those on top of each other and do all the same things. It's just, yeah, for all the reasons you say, things get really complicated when you start to move to continuous time. And but I completely agree with Ryan. I think there are functional reasons to think that decision making is discrete, and so at the level of decision making, computationally speaking, we should use discrete state space models. I also think that at a certain level, we need continuous state spaces. Obviously, we represent continuous quantities. And I think Thomas Parr, we've chatted about this before in the model stream, but Thomas Parr has a really nice paper on kind of the discrete continuous interface. And that's something I'm actually really interested in. I'm not sure. I don't know to what extent we should take these things as idealizations or as general kind of neurophysiological predictions. I think that's I'm super interested in that, in other words, but I don't know the answer.
Another thing to say though is that it's not as though only action selection has to do with discrete state spaces. There are plausibly a lot of higher level representational things that are also discrete. So for instance, like concepts, right? Yeah. Like I can have a bunch of continuously represented lower level visual features, but I can use those to infer something discrete as well. Like for instance, that those features correspond to my concept of a dog, right? Or my concept of a banana, or whatever, right? Because we do have these discrete categories that we map on patterns of continuous features to. And I mean, that's a kind of whole nother discussion. I think we talked about it briefly last time, right? Gaining conscious access to the visual features versus gaining conscious access to the fact that it is a dog, right? So those are different levels of representation that can be attended to, and may be able to kind of independently or semi-independently be accessible separately. So I just want to point out that not everything is going to be continuous in perception when sort of cast broadly.
And that's where,
yeah, I
was just gonna say that's where a lot of category theory discussion comes into play. Let's do Blue, then Christopher for final thoughts.
So I know, like, we operate under the assumption that the visual, like, we perceive things continuously in visual space, but I mean, really the input is like 60 hertz, right? So I mean, theoretically, like, this object is consistently a dog, but if it's like flashing back and forth to a cat at sub-perceptible levels, like, we wouldn't know, right? So I mean, I think anything can be modeled in discrete chunks if you break the chunks into small enough pieces.
Yeah. I've sometimes seen people like be a bit smarmy about this when they someone says like, oh, discrete state spaces are unrealistic, and the comeback is always like, mate, like, you can always discretize things up to some arbitrary level and then discrete state spaces work fine. I don't know, I actually think that's a bit of a dodge, to be honest, because the way we're using these discrete state space models is in like an ultra discrete kind of way, right? So I think that if we had a hidden Markov model where we had like a 60 hertz equivalent or something. That would just be ridiculous. Like, you should just work in continuous state spaces at that point. Like, the computational and conceptual advantages of working in a discrete state space are gone. It's so much. It would be so difficult.
It's a really nice question, though, and it's like, if you do make it a finer and finer granularity, you keep some of the really big benefits of splitting. And sometimes it's actually easier to even do like a protein folding. They'll do a time step of the tiniest amount and do millions of time steps tiny, because it's still easier to fit that ultra rich discrete time model with actual time steps that can be clustered on different computers, rather than rewrite the whole base to do continuous modeling. So I agree. It's not like continuous is simply better. And it really relates deeply to how we think about the continuum and the infinitesimal. And so it's really an interesting area for ActInf. So Stephen, and then any other closing comments?
Yeah, and I suppose if we also were to go back into the physics of it, you know, with active inference as a way of, like, if vision is feeling the surfaces out there rather than it being an input signal, even if we have these brain waves, some of that might be an artifact of cognitive science, which has got like the input process output. At some level, it's extracting, like Alex Constant talks about, extracting, you know, information from quantum noise, you know, random fluctuations and all this sort of stuff. So, you know, it could be that discrete state space is kind of, you know, sort of also because there is quite choppy what's coming in, and at some point inferences have to be made that makes it more like a signal, if that makes sense. Now, I'm just putting that out there just to that as another layer at the lower levels of the retina and stuff like that.
Sounds good. Any last comments? Otherwise, this was super interesting. I guess a closing question for the authors would just be, when's the next episode in this paper saga, or what's the next thing you're excited about here?
I am in process. We have another paper that's kind of, I don't know, maybe like 3/4 done or something like that. That's kind of the next episode of this.
Awesome.
It's
We've run
definitely
all the simulations.
Yeah, so they're done. It's an expanded model that does a lot more with, so it allows for a no report paradigm, and selective attention and working memory maintenance are explicit policies in the updated one. And there's a number of other advantages, but it's coming soon.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of me writing it, really. So.
Wow. Too real. But thanks everyone for joining. This was really fun for 18 overall, and we look forward to probably seeing you again for 19 and beyond. Thanks to all the participants. You can fill out the survey for feedback in your events calendar invitation. Otherwise, we'll be talking through other channels. So thanks everyone. See you later.